Alright, so Black Myth Wukong just released this week, and whoa boy, has it been a ride. The game came out swinging, already breaking records, reaching a peak concurrent count of 2.3 million players on Steam, and in the process dethroning Dota 2, Lost Ark, Counter-Strike, and Palworld. It now sits in second place for the highest concurrent player count of all time, behind only PUBG. So yes, the game is very popular, and not only are there millions of people playing, most of them seem to really like it as well. Steam user reviews are overwhelmingly positive with a whopping 96% rating, which is quite high. To put it in perspective, of the top 20 most played games on Steam, there are only 5 other games that have a rating over 90%, those being Elden Ring, Palworld, Valheim, Baldur's Gate 3, and Terraria, and now Black Myth Wukong making it the 6th. Now obviously the game just came out, there's a lot of positive early reviews, and this review score could change over time, but man, with the high concurrent player count and the high review rating, the game is certainly off to a good start, and it's done this in spite of all the pre-release discourse around Black Myth Wukong's development studio and their oddly specific restrictions for streamers who were given codes, which included not discussing China, feminism, or COVID. Yeah, that went over super well, as you would expect, but despite all of that, we have got the second most popular Steam game ever and overwhelmingly positive reviews. So yesterday I spent the entire day playing Black Myth Wukong for myself, and I can tell ya, I get it. This game is actually quite good, or to put it precisely, it's just plain old simple fun with good gameplay, it's relatively polished, and on top of that has no BS monetization. This is being the rare trifecta of success in the games industry nowadays. So I want to tell you a bit about the game, starting with a basic overview and then my thoughts and impressions from what I've seen so far. Now, if you didn't know, Black Myth Wukong is a fairly linear action-adventure boss rush game that tells the mythological Chinese tale of Journey to the West. You play as the Destined One, traversing the lands, meeting intriguing characters, and eliminating any foes in your path, of which there are plenty. Combat amounts to alternating combos of light and heavy attacks, with stances mixing up your moveset and potential, along with a range of abilities that you unlock as you play. The first skill that you get is this incredibly useful freeze that immobilizes any enemy, including bosses, for a few seconds, letting you chip away at their health. As for defense, it is mostly all about dodging, with perfectly timed evades being heavily rewarded. You eventually also unlock a parry in the form of this stone form ability, giving you another defensive option, but there is no blocking. Really, you're just dodging all incoming attacks. And then beyond your basic attacks and the handful of skills that you got, there are the transformations. Now initially you can turn into this pole arm wielding wolf, dishing out loads of fire damage until either his health or energy meter depletes and you transform back. And then you also have these spirits of rare enemies that you capture that can be bound to you and summoned periodically. These will have some sort of a passive effect, increasing either offensive, defensive, or your utility, along with this active ability where you temporarily, for a brief second, transform into the creature and do some specifically unique variety of attack for that spirit. And with all of these tools in place, what you're doing is moving through these mostly linear environments, taking on groups of basic enemies and bosses, lots and lots of bosses. But before I go into further detail, let me tell you about the boss of today's video. Today's video is sponsored by Guild Wars 2, a free-to-start MMO that for me has always been about world exploration and discovery. Coupled with its mostly horizontal progression system, this is a big part of what's kept me coming back. I never feel far behind or like I need to grind for weeks. I can just jump back in, play for a while, and check out the latest content. Speaking of which, they recently released the Janthier Wilds expansion on August 20th. This 5th expansion brings players to the fabled Isles of Janthier in pursuit of new adventures and rewards. In terms of the new stuff, well, there's a new weapon for all professions, the two-handed spear. Initially, this was exclusively an underwater weapon, well, there's now a land version coupled with its own unique skills for every class. They've added a housing system, homesteads, an account-wide personal instance with a structure and land for you to decorate and cultivate. They've also updated the Warclaw mount acquisition method, giving it its own mastery line. There's new challenging and cooperative content with 3 new open world world explorable maps, convergences, these 50-player events, and a new raid with challenge mode. There's a new fractal dungeon with its own challenge mode, and Wizard's Vault rewards. If you're interested in checking it out for yourself, you can use my link in the video description below. All right, so at the top, I called this a boss rush game, and that's mainly because there are bosses literally everywhere. It seems you can't turn a corner without stumbling into another boss in this game. There may very well be as many bosses as there are regular enemies. That's probably not actually the case, but honestly, it feels that way at times because you are just fighting bosses constantly. Now, from what I've seen so far, these have all been really cool looking with interesting mechanics and just genuinely fun fights. The difficulty varies for the most part. I would say it's on the easier side as I have one-shot most of these small and medium bosses, but the larger, more major fights, those kind of ramp the challenge up a little bit more, and those have taken me a few attempts in some instances. I think what I've liked the most about it though is just all of the variety. I think with one exception, I have not actually seen a repeated boss type, and even the one repeat I did see had a lot that was different about it as well. Playing for about 10 hours yesterday, I have come across 25 of the game's 90 total bosses, and every one that I've seen once again has been unique. Unique not only in how they look, but also in their movesets, in their phases, their abilities, just everything about them. We've got 90 bosses in this game. I've seen 25 of them so far, and already I've been pretty impressed with what I have seen. So basically the gist of the game is you're using this action combat, you're moving through what are mostly linear levels with branching sections, and it branches further and gets more interconnected as you move from the first to second chapter. You're fighting basic enemies, you're collecting resources as well as items that are hidden in the environment, and you are constantly engaging in boss fights. Now, in the process of you doing all of this, you're also going to be working on your character and power progression, and there's a lot of this. For one, as you level up, you gain sparks. You can also find these at certain points in the world, and these are used to improve just about everything for your character. What essentially amounts to a skill tree is broken up into 6 main categories with further subsections in many of them. First, there are the foundation abilities. These include your stamina, your martial arts, which is your basic combat, as well as your survival. Then there are the 3 staff stances of smash, pillar, and thrust. There are 3 spell schools, mysticism, alteration, and strand. And then there are your transformations. So in each of these categories are numerous improvements. Some of these categories have over 100 different individual improvements that you can invest in, and broadly speaking, these will do things like granting a variety of passive boost, allowing you to unlock new abilities and combos, and just opening up your potential moveset, adding more variety to the combat, but then also enhancing the things that you have as a baseline. Just everything across the board is about making you stronger, and then mostly what you're doing is deciding how and what you want to prioritize. If you want to be more defensive, if you want to be more offensive, if you want to focus on stamina or health, if you want to boost your crit, if you want to focus on a specific school of basically those staff stances or like schools of combat of martial arts. Do you want to focus on one of them? Do you want to spread them out amongst the 3 stances? It's really up to you, and the game lets you actually freely respec whenever you want. So you'll accumulate points, you'll spend them in a direction, but then you can freely, and as many times as you want from what I can see, respec and try out new builds as you keep playing. But that is just the spark system and the skill tree. There is a lot more to progression and improvement. So as you move through the chapters, you also unlock what are called relics that grant boost. Completing the very first chapter gives you the Craving Eyes. This has 3 options to pick from. I went with the increased critical strike damage. There's also armor sets and weapon upgrades. You unlock these by defeating bosses and progressing through the story. They will cost materials and some currency to craft, and then you can equip them, and everything comes with its own unique perks. In fact, gear pieces can have individual boost per piece of gear, along with also having set bonuses, and all of this will be for tailoring to different playstyles or for enhancing certain abilities. There are weapon upgrades that will come with their own bonus effects on top of the further upgrades dealing more damage or adding more crits. There's other equipment, which includes these curios, just think charms with their own unique effects. There's also a spot for selecting the spirit of your choice from the ones that you've captured. These spirits can also be leveled up if you have one that you really like using using. You can make it more powerful, make it cost less resource. And then there's another spot for what are called vessels. The one that I've unlocked thus far gives me like a fire debuff resistance. The game also has a bunch of different consumables. You will craft or find these, and they'll grant increased defenses, resistances, or offense, like increasing your damage, crit, or whatever. You also have this healing ability that refills anytime you rest at a shrine. It is called the Gourd. You start off with the coconut wine version, which will heal you for 33% of your health whenever you use it. But then later on, you find more, like the lamb brew, which heals you for a flat 20%, but then an additional 25% heal over time. And these can be upgraded as you progress, granting more uses or better healing. And then there's also a slot within those for what are called soaks, giving you additional benefits for whatever particular gourd that you're using. So this can increase your resistances, add damage reduction, have you gain more health when you use it, or make things like certain spells free to cast for a duration. They also make use of a key system where as you're progressing, you'll come across locked areas, and then you will have to find the keys, usually via defeating a boss, to allow you to progress past that previously locked area. So that is the basic overview. That's like the general gist of Black Myth Wukong. You move through these levels, you fight basic enemies, you collect stuff, you fight bosses. There are some branching paths, there's a bit of exploration, there are locked gates which you have to find the keys through, and that's how the game works. That's the general kind of flow of the game. I've seen it compared to Nioh. It reminds me a lot of God of War. The only kind of Souls-like reference is the fact that there are shrines that sort of work like bonfires. You can fast travel to them, you do some of your progression and upgrading there, and then also whenever you rest, refilling your health and your mana and your stamina, it also respawns enemies. But that's really the only Souls-like equivalent that the game has, because the combat is kind of just much more like modern day action game a la God of War, or again, I see Nioh referenced quite a lot, but I haven't played Nioh yet. So yeah, that's the overview. What about my thoughts? Well, I gotta say, just right baseline, I am quite impressed with the game so far, and I've only played it for a day. I can absolutely, though, see why it's doing so well. So for starters, the production value is very, very high. So it looks fantastic visually. This is a gorgeous game. The first chapter alone really hooked me, traversing these winding paths through this kind of darker, heavily forested mountainside region. That setting alone I love, but it was just made all the better with how good it looks. Just like everything about the visuals, the lighting, the effects, the fidelity of it all. It's a very pretty looking game. And then also the enemy and character design I think is great, from the destined one who you are playing to all of the enemies and bosses you encounter. I just think they did a good job here. They've really delivered a kind of this interesting presentation of these creatures from Chinese mythology. I mean, not only their look, but like the outfits they're wearing, the stuff that you're wearing, your armor sets and weapons, just all of the design to the characters and the setting. It's all really well done. I would say as well, along those same lines, it's just nice to get this sort of relatively novel setting and story. While we have seen a handful of successful games in Eastern settings in recent years, we get so few of them that really lean heavily into the mythological and popular folklore of the region. And I love this. Like, everything about the developers' take on the Journey to the West story is really neat to see in action. It's neat to play through this world and see these mythological creatures and fight these bosses. Also, for how good everything looks, I was pretty impressed with the performance. I would say about 95% of the time, the game would run flawlessly for me at 144 frames per second at a 2K resolution. Although I will add, there were a handful of moments in my playthrough with substantial issues. There were a few sections as I was playing where I would see the frame rate drop from like 144 down to 20 all of a sudden. Now, in those instances, this would last anywhere from like 10 to 15 seconds before smoothing out again. I'm not sure if it was an issue with shaders or if the game was loading in new areas while I was running around. I have heard that there have been some potential conflicts and issues with Intel CPUs, so maybe that's what was going on. Frankly, I don't know exactly, but again, mostly at least 95, it's probably closer to 99% of the total playtime, it ran amazingly, flawlessly, but with those few noticeable exceptions. Oh, and also the whole thing is very polished. It's just crisp and clean across the board. The animations of the movement, attacks, the spells, the enemies. There's all sorts of little flourishes, like how your character spins his staff or jumps over the terrain or moves in the environment. The environment itself, the lighting and the sounds. There's just like across the board, there's a high degree of polish and a real lack of jank in this game. I couldn't believe just how well it played and how good it looked and how polished everything was. It just feels like a very complete and well done game. And then finally, the combat. It's simple, but it's quite fun. boss variety, as I mentioned earlier, has been nice, even though I've only seen 25 of the 90 bosses. They've all been varied and interesting encounters thus far. And while I think the game might be a tad on the easier side overall, I would say that there's still enough challenge to make most of the more challenging fights feel satisfying. And even some of the basic encounters, like if you're not paying proper attention, you can quickly lose an encounter and then find yourself resurrecting back at one of the shrines. And all that is well and good, but I really think the cherry on top here is that this is just a plain old no BS game. It's a single player title with roughly 25 to 50 hours of content, depending on how completionist you want to be. I guess it's 25 for a straight simple playthrough, but 50 if you're going to be collecting and picking up a lot of the side stuff. And it's got an upfront box price, and that's all. There is no in-game store, there are no premium currencies, no FOMO microtransactions, and no battle passes. You just buy the game, you play the game, you enjoy the game, and you stop when you're done. No predatory manipulation to try to squeeze more money out of you along the way. And that, coupled with everything else that I mentioned, with it being a great looking game, a cool and novel setting, good performance, and the fact that it's fun to play, and that it's all polished and feels like just a finished product, like I'm paying for something that was fully realized and done when I got my hands on it, that is absolutely why the game is doing so insanely well. 2.3 million concurrent players, nearly 200,000 overwhelmingly positive reviews with a 96% rating. That is crazy. Now, unsurprisingly, a big part of the game's success comes from its popularity in China, where it looks to be getting loads of play. That is unsurprising because, well, like I said, from what I've seen so far, it looks like a genuinely solid game, and the game is based on a beloved story from Chinese mythology. So yes, it makes sense that it's doing well over there. But in the discussions about this, I've seen people using its popularity in China almost as a way to write off the game's success, to write off its high player count and its positive ratings, as if the Chinese players don't count. But also, I think we should keep in mind plenty of other of the most successful games, of massively popular games, had a lot of their success due in part to their popularity in China as well. This isn't the first game to be popular in China that was just popular overall. And really, my take on this situation and this game in general is that yes, it does seem to be a game that is clearly massively popular in China, but also one that has global appeal because it's a good game. Like, it may be more popular in terms of the raw player numbers than it is in the West over there, but that doesn't make it not popular here. And from what I've seen, from what I've played, I do think Black Myth Wukong is a pretty good game. Now, this isn't a full-on review. I haven't finished the game, and there are some gripes and complaints, you know, for as flawlessly as it ran most of the time. Those times when it did have issues, that sucked. It wasn't great. I like it to be smooth the entire time that I'm playing, even if it's just like 1% hitching, right? But then also, just in general, the game is incredibly linear. Now, the first chapter is like the most linear. As you move into chapter 2, it opens up a bit more, not in like the amount of explorable space within a path, but the fact that there are multiple paths that are branching and interconnecting. But I do wish there was more freedom within those areas. So you'll be moving around a play space and there's just a lot of invisible walls everywhere. You can basically just mostly walk on the ground and you can't even go on top of certain buildings. So for example, there might be a building somewhere and walkable paths all around the building, but even though your character should be able to climb on top of the building, like based on how high they can jump and their moves and everything, the game puts invisible walls that prevent you from doing so. And that kind of thing, I wish they kind of just lifted the restrictions a little bit more. I haven't finished the game. This isn't a thorough review, obviously. I'm just kind of giving you my baseline impressions and a general overview of Black Myth Wukong. But really, the main point is that this game, from what I've played, it genuinely seems good, surprisingly so. I wasn't expecting much. I was almost not even going to play Black Myth Wukong because I heard it was like a boss rushy game, and I just really wasn't in the mood for it this week, but my friend convinced me to do so, and I'm glad I sat down to play it because after the first hour or two, I was hooked, and then I just kept on playing all day, and I had an absolute blast. I haven't finished the game. Again, this is not a full, thorough review, but from what I've seen so far, it's pretty good, and I'm not surprised it's doing as well as it is. I might do a follow-up video later on with some wrapped-up thoughts, but in general, Black Myth Wukong took me by surprise. It's actually a good game. It's a polished game. It plays well. It's fun. It's an interesting setting. Not much else to say, and there's no BS in the game. Look at that. Even with all that controversy pre-release about like streamers not being able to talk about China or radical feminism or COVID, bottom line, end of the day is they have a good game, they have a fun game, they have a complete game, and it's not filled with predatory crap. That's all it takes to make gamers happy. I know it's asking for a lot. That's it for today. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the vid. Have you played Black Myth Wukong? What do you think of the game thus far? Let me know below. Thanks for watching. See you guys next time.